Welcome to the Educating Mindfully Learncast, where we support mental health and well-being in education through mindfulness-based learning. Our Learncast is like a podcast, but with connected, reflective learning in our online community, which also has the opportunity for educators to earn professional development hours. This Learncast is a special experience for mindful educators and leaders to personally grow their practices within and beyond education as mindful global citizens. Before we begin, we invite you to pause where you are for an invitational intention. Perhaps placing your hands on your heart. And together we will take 4 collective breaths, 1 breath for each ripple within our framework's educational ecosystem. Breathing in first for ourselves, and exhale. Next, breathing in for our staff, and exhale. Then breathing in for our students, and exhale. And breathing in for society as a whole, including families and communities. And exhale. Consider pausing and committing to yourself a collective intention by saying, I am a mindful global citizen. We look forward to learning with you as we continue educating mindfully together. My name is Lindsey Frank, and on behalf of our leadership team, we thank you for being you. Our episodes are supported by our mindful partners. Consider becoming a mindful partner today to be featured on an upcoming Learncast episode. Learn more at educatingmindfully.org/partners. Welcome to the second episode of the Educating Mindfully Learncast titled Seen, Heard, Valued, Mindful Teaching for Equity and Connection. I am Lindsey Frank, the Educating Mindfully President, Director, and the host for today's episode. And I'm here with Dr. Kristi Morale. Welcome, Kristi.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So Dr. Kristi Morale is a passionate educator, speaker, and advocate for equitable, healing-centered schools. With over 15 years in education, she began her career in elementary classrooms before transitioning to social and emotional learning and behavioral support. She holds degrees from Dillard University, the University of Southern California, and Texas Southern University. It's amazing how much she learns and grows. Where her dissertation examined how SEL practices affected the discipline rates of Black middle school girls. Kristi is the founder of the Innocent Brown Girl Project and host of the Teach Her, capital H-E-R, podcast. She currently supports middle school students and staff as a guidance facilitator and serves on the board of Educating Mindfully. So thank you for sharing this space and this time together, Kristi.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to chat.
So as we begin, I want to share with our mindful community a bit of background information around our mindfulness-based learning framework and defining culturally affirming and equitable practices for just that shared context. So for our listeners, that's where we're going to be beginning. So our framework itself looks like an ecosystem. And so we invite you to visit educatingmindfully.org/framework so that you can see a visual. And we will link that in our notes as well for the episode. And within the ecosystem, there are four raindrops, and those raindrops represent the four essential practices that nourish the entire education ecosystem. And one of those practices is the culturally affirming and equitable practices, which is our focus today for our time. And to define what that means, we're sharing that culturally affirming and equitable practices are practices that honor each person's identity and experiences to cultivate belonging, where every learning community member is seen, heard, valued, and supported. And within that definition, there really are two main words that we want to name and call forward that often hold misconceptions, and that includes culture and equity or equitable. And so, first, to share about culture, when we're calling that forward and naming culture, we all have our own cultures, and culture lives within us and around us. It is our identities, our experiences, histories, beliefs, values, traditions, and ways of being that are shared within a community. Culture is what shapes us. And the other word that we want to name here as well is equity. And equity is meeting people where they are and assuring that they get what they need to learn, grow, and thrive. Meaning it is not necessarily the same, but it is what is supportive to their needs to access the experience. So I'm going to pause there, and even as a learning community, just let those definitions and words just land on the heart for a moment, maybe taking a collective breath in and collective breath out. And then I'd love to invite Kristi, your voice now to come forward. Any other connections with even the words culture and equitable? Or do we want to dive right into some other questions? Where are we feeling we'd like to go here?
So, the one thing I do want to note is, and someone told me this years ago when I first started in education, is, equity is not equal, right? And I think that's something that we really have to consider as educators. And when we're working with students, especially students from different cultures and different backgrounds, that what one student needs is not necessarily the same as what another student needs. And it's not the same at the same time, right? Different kids need different things at different times. So I think that's just one thing, to consider, especially, in a classroom. I was in an elementary classroom, so we heard that's not fair all the time. So just keeping that in mind, like, you know, um, equity is not, equal. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, and being in this space, especially within the elementary space, though this can even be with junior high. There was a lesson, and I'm sure you probably did this lesson too, where like using a Band-Aid and how basically, you would basically tell students that they had all these different injuries, but they all got a Band-Aid to solve that
Right.
injury, but it didn't actually work for everybody. So I
Mhm.
just, love that really concrete opportunity to portray what equity means. And it is about getting what we need so that we can have the supports to be successful. So thank you for sharing that. And for our listeners, maybe that's a lesson that might be interesting to take a look at.
Yes, absolutely.
So this really brings us to the question, how do we build mindful learning communities where every child, every staff member, and family feels seen, heard, and valued? Like, what does that look like, sound like, feel like?
So I think first of all, it begins with intention, right? Like anything, you have to want to do it. And in that, creating space where belonging is designed, right? Not assumed. Like you don't just assume that everyone feels safe or belongs in a space, right? You are intentional about creating that space so that they would feel that way. So in mindful learning communities, belonging is like the baseline, right? You have to start there. It's not the bonus. It's not, when I coach teachers, I think about it as kind of like sometimes we get to the point where we skip some steps and we get right into the academic part of it. And then we try to go back and add um, these kind of supports and creating this safe space for our scholars. And it's like, okay, well, you really needed that for them to even learn anything from you. But we kind of added on like a bonus as opposed to the baseline. So it looks like you embedding student voice into the structure of your day.
Mm.
Curiosity before correction is something that I really love for teachers to consider or educators to consider because it's like, before we get to start correcting our kids, we have to teach them, right? You can't just assume that they know anything. Psychological safety for everyone in the room. So that goes for, or in your space, that goes for the educators there, the parents, the scholars, and centering relationships over anything, any of the other millions of things that we're required to do in a day, including like compliance, right? Because you really need the relationships before you can get anywhere else, right? It's like stepping stones. You start with the relationship and honoring culture as a source of strength, not something that has to be managed, not um, considering it as something that's going to help you to get to know your scholars and build this relationship in this safe space. And I really think when students and families walk in and see their language, their history, their values all reflected, right? They know that they matter, right? So that determines what kind of conversations you're able to have with people. When parents walk in, and they feel like they matter, their culture matters, their kids matter, they're much more open to whatever it is you need to share with them. When you walk into a space and you see nothing that reflects you or your family, you're not going to assume the best of the educators that are supporting your kids. And that doesn't mean that they are not looking out for your scholar's best interest, but that's not the way you're going to feel, right? So you're not entering with this mindset of we are here to work together to best support my child's needs, right? You're like, I'm not really sure about these people. Um, and you're gonna be, a little bit more unsure about what they're telling you about how they're helping your child and those kind of things. So just really creating those safe spaces for everyone, and just being open to receiving, support from them because you're not going to know everything, right? If it's not your culture, why, ask questions and find out, Um, so I always think that having parents as a part of this process is super important as well.
Yeah, and I really appreciate what you named there, and even like the powers in the subtle. You were naming a lot of things within the environment, being able to see and the values or within books, all of those different pieces are so essential. Have you seen anything in the work that you've been doing that is like stuck with you that really affirmed students or families and staff? Like, is something coming to mind that you've seen that can inspire others?
I think one of the things that I'm seeing now in some schools that I just love are the new types of murals that are being painted inside of schools, with culturally relevant things as well as affirming um, words and just I've been in some schools that were so nicely decorated and in such an inclusive manner that it made me feel welcome. So I assume like the kids feel welcome to be there, right? Because I'm not even the target audience. So um I think those things are really amazing. On the flip side, we have some schools that have some work to do because we do have some really outdated murals and things painted on some campuses that are sometimes you walk in and you're like, wait, now why is that still here? So I think we kind of have to be mindful of that because we do, especially in public education, lots of buildings are old, lots of things are there that, we assume, especially if you're an adult entering a space every day, you kind of are like, you don't pay attention to it, right? But we have to consider that we get new kids every day, every year. And parents, so just making sure that we're updating those kinds of things, that we're um relating them to the current demographics that we serve, right? Neighborhoods change. areas of town change and, those kind of things, the demographics change. So just being mindful of those things as well and making sure that we're keeping those things updated. Um, and then in classrooms, teachers have sometimes a little bit more control. So just ensuring that the posters that are on the wall and those kind of things are culturally affirming to all the kids you serve, right? Not just one subpopulation.
Oh, thank you. And, made me think of two other connected pieces here. One is, for example, if there are any listeners here that are in communities that maybe there's not a budget for being able to have a mural, that even just like having a shared giant piece of paper and being able to connect in those ways and being creative that can mirror what a mural might look like. And then also, it's reminding me of one of our lesson inspirations that we have as an organization that our members have access to. And it is basically creating a tree that uses buttons, and the buttons have
Mhm.
different colors. And each person takes that mindful global citizen promise, whether they are students, staff, or even society and families. Whenever they visit the school, they can add that to the tree. So by the end of the year, there's this giant tree that's like this community that's just filled with all the colors. um, it just reminded me of that. So we'll put that in the resources too.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. And I love how these are just small, easily accessible for people to integrate, even just one small practice to start somewhere. Um, so I'm thinking about in our framework, our mindfulness based learning skills, those are our trees. So we have the mindful self regulation, mindful self connection, mindful decision making, and mindful social connection. So those are the four trees in the framework. And I'm wondering, how does the intersection of mindfulness and culturally affirming and equitable practices elevate those skills? Like, how does mindfulness help all of those aspects in regards to our culturally affirming and equitable practices that we can integrate?
Right. So I think when mindfulness is rooted in equity and culture, then it's not just a regulation tool, right? It becomes more of a liberatory practice. So we are really working for mindful self-connection to become like identity affirmation, right? So the kids to be able to affirm themselves, right? And each other, right? And then the mindful social connection is becomes more like culturally responsive relationship building, like us really being intentional about that piece of it. And how you build relationships with others is different depending on their culture and their background and yours, right? Because there's things you don't know about people, right? So, and that of course goes back to the safe space and having that safe space so that questions can be asked and, you can really inquire to learn more because ultimately that's what we want our scholars to be doing, right? When we think about that social awareness, that's the goal is for them to be able to do that with each other. And then mindful decision making becomes like it almost like critically reflective leadership, right? Because we want everyone to grow in that area, but we want decision making is I work in a middle school now, so just thinking about decision making and how we support kids with making responsible decisions. Um, but we really want them to be mindful of the decisions that they're making. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of times it's I don't want to say easier to teach, but it is easier to teach when you get to the other side of it, right? Because then you can reflect back on it. You have an actual experience to draw from, right? So sometimes, I guess that's why they say, you learn from mistakes, right? Because we
Right.
need them to have that background so that we can kind of move them towards that leadership piece and being reflective, and making better choices on the other side of it. And then self-regulation shifts from like compliance to co-regulation. Um, which the compliance piece is so important in our schools. It's what we spend most of our time doing, unfortunately. But we really try to move that to co-regulation and community care, right? And then I think that's kind of the baseline of the compliance, right? Everything that you do from there just builds upon that. But that community care is so important, especially with so many different things going on in our world, in our kids experience so much more than like we experienced growing up, right? Especially with like the use of social media and all of that. So just giving them those tools to use these mindfulness practices as they go through life and go through these situations that, we didn't experience. I mean, I hear about things on a daily basis and I'm like, what? That happened? Okay. So really just getting these tools to be relational, intersectional, and justice driven when they get to moving throughout the world and making these decisions and building relationships and all of these things as they continue to grow.
Yeah, wow. And I feel like a lot of what you're saying is so proactive, right? I think that's that shift of even when we're saying all this compliance, right? That comes from that space of reactivity where when we can intentionally start to invite the proactive side. We need to have the reactive side, there things
Right.
will happen, but if we can continue to, like you shared, the co-regulation space and at that intersection where we're understanding like compliance to somebody might mean compliance to somebody else, right?
Right.
And yeah, I don't know if you want to talk any further about what that might look like for or sound like, but I really feel this sense of proactive that's coming through your share.
Yeah, I think it's just, I think we spend so much time in schools being reactive. Um, and sometimes it's hard to even get to a space where you can be proactive, right? Because it's like if you're always putting out fires, then when do you ever have time to like build and not be, just dealing with something. So I think that the base of that is having the relationships, right? Because I think the stronger our relationships are, the less things we'll have to react to, right? So just teaching our kids to how to build positive relationships with each other, how to have positive relationships with adults and having positive relationships with us as well, so that we don't get into as many situations that we have to react to, and then we have more time to be proactive. But just being intentional. And it doesn't have to be big shifts, right? There are small things that you can do, and small examples you can use in your classroom of like, okay, well, from books you read and those kind of things, right? All of that, can be used to teach bite-size things to kids or lessons, right? That we maybe have not encountered and hope to not encounter. Um, so just kind of, I guess it's really a mindset shift, just switching your mindset to being more proactive, which and then those small things will kind of come into play. You can kind of start thinking about, oh, well, this is a good way to do whatever. We're doing this lesson. Let me include this piece. Um, so that hopefully it'll help us to not have ABC issue on the, at some point during the year. But I think the big thing is the mindset shift, because I think when we're always thinking, I don't have time to do this because something's going to happen, or I don't have time, and that's the same thing with compliance. I don't have time to build relationships with my students because I have to make sure I have, 12 grades in the grade book. I don't have time to do, this, and this. Well, you can do both. You can build relationships with your kids and make sure you have 12 grades in the grade book. But I think just making sure that we're shifting our mindset to that positive thinking, right?
Mhm.
And it takes a while, right? But you just have to, you know, um, just keep trying. It's
Right?
really just keep trying.
Yes. Well, and so again, just a couple other things that I heard from that is not only that mindset shift, but we also have that perspective shift when we can look from that culturally affirming aspect and that equity aspect. When we come into that space of presence and that mindful space, we then have that way of seeing all these different perspectives. And I think this is just a really nice layering from our first episode as well, from the presence and embodiment. But that aside, I really feel that that perspective comes through, even with the shift that might be there. So
Right.
and for the grades, we can start empowering our students to also be able to self help with that self assessment piece and that
Yes,
empowerment piece. So
yes,
we can do both, just
yes,
creatively.
absolutely, absolutely.
Oh, anything else you want to share about that? Or I have another question for you.
Okay. All right. All right.
Oh. All right. So something else that's coming to mind, and as we're talking about this and these little mini practices, are just asking like, what are some guiding questions for educators and leaders that maybe they can ask themselves or that they can ask their teams to basically cross check if they are embedding culturally affirming and equitable practices, both personally, because we know this is all inner work too,
Right.
and also in their learning community. So it's almost like this just reflection, making sure that these practices are in place. Have you had different questions or strategies that you can share that are coming to mind?
Yeah, well, first of all, the biggest one is going to be who is centered in your classroom. Who think about who's missing from your curriculum, who's missing from examples that you use, right? Who's missing from your attention? Who are you paying attention to versus not paying attention to? And with my research specifically on girls, a lot of times our girls are the ones kind of missing from the conversations in the classrooms, right? Because they tend to be a little quieter. They tend to not express themselves until it gets to like a boiling point. So just think about that. Think about who are the kids that you spend the most time talking to, right? A lot of times we spend so much time talking to kids who are having situations arise that a lot of kids get left, kind of left out. So consider that. Do your students feel safe to take emotional and academic risks, right? So if every time you're giving an assignment, scared students are scared, right? That's something you need to think about, right? And so we might think on the one hand, oh, well, it's good, they want to do their best. They're scared they're not going to make an A. But, life is not always going to be an A, right? So we do want them to feel safe to be able to take those emotional risks, to take academic risks, right? Your classroom should feel like a safe space to be able to do that. If they have to get up and present, they should, of course, you're going to have kids that are shy and so forth, but they shouldn't feel scared to stand up, right? They shouldn't feel like, you or their classmates are going to say something negative at the end of it. Of course, kids are going to be kids, right? But when you have that classroom community built, your kids are less likely to discourage others or have those, my theme used to always be positive vibes only, right, in my classroom. So every year I'd have all my positive vibes decorations and stuff like that. But you have to lead with that, right? So it has to be more than just, whatever you have up, more than just those things on the wall. You have to really make sure that your kids feel safe with you and with each other. And then think about where biases show up, right? Now, we all have biases, whether we know it or not, but where they show up in discipline, where they show up in feedback, where they show up in expectations, right? Sometimes we expect kids to, we expect little Johnny to always, be getting in trouble. And I feel bad for Johnny because he's always the example we use in
It's
education,
always the
right?
example.
Or we may expect Ashley to, always be perfect, so, but, Johnny's going to do good. Sometimes Ashley's going to mess up. Sometimes it's life, right? But we want to just consider that. Are we spending too much time, on the negative discipline, situations as opposed to, you know, parent phone calls that might have something positive to say about a kid, right? All kids deserve, some sort of feedback. So, what does that look like? Are you only giving feedback to kids who, are always doing the right thing? And you're just like, oh, such and such, you know, is not reading on level, so I don't really have anything positive to say. I just don't say anything at all. Okay, well, that's not the answer either. Has he grown? Have they grown? Sharing those things as well. Inviting student voice. So thinking about, am I inviting student voice or shaping it to fit my comfort, right? Because sometimes you're like, if I let them talk too much, then I'll have to, that's going to be more work for me because now I got to figure out whatever. If I ask them what they like, now I have to go find books for my classroom library that fit their likes, So consider those things. Yes, it might be a little bit more work for you on the other side, but think about how that's going to help that student to feel safe in your space. And then when we think about your norms or your rules, right? Are they based on dominant culture values or do they reflect your actual students, right? Do you just have things up on the wall that, are safe to have, up as far as, what the expectations are in the room. Um, you know, I've seen rules where like, you're only talking when you have permission and those kind of things. Like, okay, you
Yeah, the
know,
only raise your hand situation.
right, you have to raise your hand to talk, and it's
There
just
are
like,
more ways
okay.
to share your voice than raising your hand.
Right, exactly, exactly, right. Don't come to the desk or you have to flip a switch or, like I want you to feel safe to get up and come and ask me a question if you have a question. So just creating that space where your scholars feel safe with you and feel safe with each other. So really think about it. And it might take some time. You might have to do just be more mindful during a day of school. Think about, okay, today, you tally marks, like every time you talk to little Johnny versus every time you talk to Ashley, or, um, when your students are working independently, what are they doing when they need help? Are they, because you could tell who needs help, right? Without them getting up or them saying anything, right? So if you see Ashley looking around the room as opposed to getting up, then she's scared. So you need to consider how you can make all of your kids feel safe, whereas, Johnny might jump out of his chair and come running to your desk every 5 minutes. Ashley may just look around for 5 minutes and see if you're going to notice her. So just kind of take stock of what's actually happening in your classroom. But I think that first step is really that first question is like, who is centered, right? Who is centered in your classroom? And if it's you, that's a problem too, right? If you're only teaching the way you learn, that's a problem as well. So consider those things to make sure that you are um, giving all of your students what they need when they need it.
Yes. Thank you for sharing all of that. Oh gosh, there's so much. Um, what's kind of sticking with me, we'll see kind of how the order comes, but there was so much of what you shared, like even just what you mentioned about how Ashley and Johnny have their different needs. And so you by just recognizing that both the culturally affirming and equitable practices are there right in play when we as educators and leaders can recognize that, and that shows up in our staff too. If
Right.
teachers are not coming to their leaders for support, or we have to be aware of all that, and same with families, so
Right.
we can see those different patterns. So I appreciate you calling that forward as well.
Mhm.
And silence is saying something. You mentioned by when that's, when we're not speaking up, and also, gosh, shaping to my comfort. That really stuck with me, what you shared. As just like, hearing you share. And then also just taking risks. And yeah, I'm wondering if even there are different kinds of lessons that can, they're like small bite-sized risks that students can continue to practice so that they can slowly develop that skill set.
Right.
Even speaking in front of a class is
Right.
that's a risk that they're willing to take. And
Right.
what will my peers think of me, and when I do that, and just that constant space. And I'm thinking about the mindful practices that we like to integrate, where even the affirmations that can come up to continue to build, and having those class affirmations maybe instead of
Mhm.
those rules and
Right.
expectations, right? And
Yeah,
I'm sure you've seen that.
absolutely.
Anything else coming to mind that you want to share or integrate for just any other questions or guidance to make sure that all of this is integrated into our forefront vision when we're thinking about these practices?
I think what you said about like bite-sized pieces is really important. Because I think in education, we have a tendency to go 0 to 100 on things, right? It happens with curriculum, it happens to, with everything. We're like, oh, we throw everything away and we start with something new, right? Um, and I think so that's kind of like our mindset just naturally because that's kind of how things have been done traditionally. So I think just considering that, these are humans, right? And so you're not going to be able to just say, okay, well, we have, this student who doesn't even talk, to me. They're not going to just hop up in front of the room and just, spill their guts, right? And the flip side of that is you have kids who do, right? That you maybe don't want to as much, right? You maybe want to give someone else a chance. So I think just, considering doing things in small pieces, right? We scaffold everything we teach, right? So scaffolding those kinds of skills as well. Just getting kids to slowly get into, those safe spaces and to feel safe, right? Um, And I've had kids that start the school year where, they're so shy at meet the teacher, they're hiding behind their parent. And I taught fourth and fifth grade, so I had a little bit older kids, but and then by the end of the year, they're in front of the room. They're, the teacher when when the district comes in for their walkthroughs, they're the one that's sitting in front of the room doing the teaching, right? Where I'm just like the guide or whatever. So I think, but it didn't happen overnight, right? It's you just take it a little bit at a time. And I think one of the things that sometimes we miss out on when we are educators is not sharing ourselves with our kids, like our personalities, our backgrounds, and those kind of things. Because I was the kid who was super duper shy. I didn't talk until I got to college. I have a little sister that's a year younger than me, so we were in school pretty much together all the time, and she was not shy at all, so it worked, right? We would make friends together, we would do everything together. And then when I went to college, she was still in high school, so I was by myself. So that's how I ended up talking. So I think but it wasn't an overnight thing, right? And also at that point, it was like I had to because nobody else was there. But I think we just share those kind of experiences with our kids, and I tell my kids even now, when they're shy, I'm like, this was me, and now I do this, I talk to people all day. So, I think sharing those pieces of you with them. And the same thing goes for your culture, and your background and those kind of things. Because if you don't share them, they're gonna find out anyway. I had a partner teacher who got engaged and she didn't tell the kids. And she was like, "Oh, I'm not gonna tell them, it's not a big deal." And then finally they're at the small group table one day and they're like, "Miss such and such, is that a promise ring?" And she's like, "No." They're like, "Are you engaged? We need to meet him. When is he coming up here?" And all of these
Instant
things. Not
class
like they
approval.
say, right. They needed to they need to vet him now, like they're like, bring him to the school. Like he needs to come meet us. So
Mhm.
I'm just like, if you don't give them, that let them get to know you. They're gonna get to know you, right? And so to me, it's like I'd rather them truly know me because I shared myself than for them to kind of or make up stories, right, about you in their head, right? They're gonna think, oh, she's such and such. I'm telling you, telling kids you have a dog like totally shifts their brain. Like they're like, wait, what? You have a pet too? Like, okay, like
Wait, you're
you're just a
human?
whole different person,
You like
right?
dogs?
Right. You're like a whole different person now. Like so
Oh,
I
I love
think just
that.
just doing those things as well, like sharing those pieces of you. And it makes teaching so much more fun too, because when you are doing different things or you're reading books and you make connections to characters in the stories, that helps them to make connections. They're like, okay, people are really connecting to these books. You're not just asking me to do something. This is something that you really do, when you're reading as well. So
Yeah, well, and that's like the importance of that embodiment piece, where when we can embody and be fully confident within ourselves to share our hearts with our students that are relative to whatever is being invited into that classroom space. It's just really so essential, and the relationships are key. And that's where, in our framework, that mindful social connection, we are helping to develop that by being ourselves truly.
right, absolutely.
So I have another question now. This is probably it's going to be a little bit deeper, and it's basically like the opposite. So what is the impact on learning communities when culturally affirming and equitable practices are not integrated? So like, do you have recommendations on how to even compassionately call forward when even in conversations with somebody, because this is an area of emotion for some people with the culturally affirming and equitable practices right now. So especially when like these emotions are activated with people who are learning and trying to understand how to integrate this, how might this look like? What advice could you maybe share to help bridge this for people?
So I think the first piece of it is when those practices are not there, the equitable practices and culturally affirming equitable practices are not there, that students internalize that as invisibility, right? Because you're not, it's like I don't even exist, right? Because there's nothing here that reminds me of a safe space, right? Generally, your home is a safe space, right? For most people, right? So depending on your background, your home looks a certain way, right? It smells a certain way. It, like it's like, you go to your grandmother's house, right? You expect certain things, right? And when you go into you walk into a school that nothing there is like you, right? It's like, okay, well, if nothing looks like me, then I don't know how to feel, I don't know how to act, I don't know what to do, right? So that's when kids start to disengage or act out or shrink, right? And they feel like no one cares about them, right? Um, your families may start to withdraw, right? Because nobody's coming to family night at a school that doesn't feel safe, right? If um we're inadvertently sometimes recreating the harm, right? Because um we a lot of times culturally we've come from spaces, depending on our backgrounds, right, that didn't feel safe. So we're just reminding families of like what that felt feels like, right, as opposed to giving them the opposite, which is what our goal should be. So I think the first thing is like when calling it forward for other people, start with compassion, not correction, right?
Mhm.
You can acknowledge people's discomfort and you can say like, okay, let's pause and let's reflect, right? Let's think about it. um, and I think for that, a lot of times when we take a minute and really think about what it is we're being asked to do, it makes sense, right? Because if you tell an adult, like, okay, if you walk into a place, to shop, right, and people are following you around, or people are, nobody sits, welcomes you, nobody is, you don't feel safe, like you don't feel like you want to stick around, right? Same thing with, a restaurant or job or whatever, so when they think about it like that, it's like, okay, well, I understand. And, I don't ever want kids to walk into my classroom and feel like that, right? I've had those experiences before. And you can validate their perspective. And then affirm that we are all committed to these kids in this school, right? We are committed to these students. We just kind of have to shift our mindset and our perspective and think about, what we can do. And everything's not in our control, right? So with everything, you can, start small and grow as you can. And then just build on their strengths, right? Because we hope that everyone who's in this space has the best interests of the kids in mind, right? Sometimes we just don't know how to get there, but build on what it is that they are doing, right? So I could see that, you have every morning you share affirmations with your kids, right? Okay, that's a great start. Let's think about how we can extend that a little bit. Let's think about this specific piece of your classroom that we can kind of adjust. Maybe you have pictures on the wall of, the scientists, right? Let's think about how we can add some other pictures to the wall of maybe some scientists that don't all look the same, right? Did you know that there's um these specific, scientists that were African American women, or, from whatever background, right? And we can just integrate that. Or we can look at your books. Okay, what are you doing this week for Read Aloud? How can we adjust some of that, right? To include some other backgrounds in what you're doing. It doesn't have to be a huge shift at one time, right? Everything is, we start small and we grow from there. And then bridge toward like a more inclusive approach through that work, right? Through these small practices that will extend, to different parts of your classroom and different parts of your work with your students.
Yeah, I think thank you for sharing all of that. And the big thing that stuck with me from what you shared was invisibility. When these practices aren't in place, we're basically creating this wall of invisibility and not belonging. And when that happens, and the withdrawal that you mentioned, the disengagement, all of that then has to go somewhere. And so that's where we might see behavior, we might see that withdrawal. And so, really having the clear lens of how essential these practices are. And when we're able to do that with that mindful approach, with true presence, with the whole experience, we can really make those connections intentional. And also, when we are engaging in those conversations where people may have misunderstandings or misconceptions around the practices in general, like you shared, that compassion over correction, I love that. And just really, when we can tune in and become present to it, we can feel within, we can know how is my body reacting in this moment, and how can I take these mindful steps and approaches to support the growth of whomever I'm in that conversation with, and also
Mhm.
myself. I can take that
Right.
step back, have that perspective, validate and affirm, like you mentioned. And when I was at a district where I was teaching at, we did a lot of work with Dr. Holly, and he called that vabbing, right? That validate,
Mhm.
affirm,
Yeah.
build the skills, and then bridge. So
Mhm.
that's always stuck with me, and it's just such a lovely path that we can do in those relationships and conversations that we have.
Right.
Ooh, thanks for sharing all of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, you shared with me prior with how culturally affirming mindfulness-based learning is for educators who are seeking to teach with presence, purpose, and heart. And I'm wondering if you can share more about this. Like, how does this approach look a little different or feel a little different than just regular old teaching or leading?
Right. So I think it keeps you anchored in your why, right? And we hear about the why all the time, right? Like every year we have to share our why, right? And some days, our why may change a little bit. Some days, but we're always asked to think about our why, right? So educators who teach with presence and purpose are often the caregivers, advocates, right? We're not just showing up just to do the baseline of what we're asked to do, right? Because we know that the teaching job is just so much beyond what is written in that job description, right? People have no idea. Um,
Definitely. Yeah, they have
it's
no idea.
right. Like
If
when
people
I
only knew.
right, you tell people about your day, they're like, wait, what? Like you did all of that in one work day? Like so I think the culturally affirming mindfulness gives, educators tools to stay grounded in high stakes spaces, right? Which a lot of times, especially when we get towards the compliance part, right? It's a lot. Um, and to be able to hold boundaries and breathe through that resistance, right? Because ultimately what we do is what our kids are gonna do. Um, and then lead with clarity and not reactivity, right? We spend so much time reacting to things. So just when you are a mindful educator, you are able to take those breaths when you need to. I always say like an unregulated or dysregulated adult can't regulate a child, right? So you have to be able to create that space for yourself. And you'll see it show up in your kids, right? When you have a classroom that is cool and calm, right? Your kids respond that way. People used to ask me like, how do you get kids to sit down and read for long periods of time? And I'm like, well, I create the environment that would make you want to sit down and read, right? So I would have quiet music playing. We would pick a scene and put it on the projector every day where the kids could decide where we're going to go. Oh, we want to be in the mountains today, or we want to be, on the beach or whatever. So their nervous systems were calm when it was time to read, right? Because it's not always that kids don't like to read. It's that they're never in an environment where they can just read. Because when we ask them to read during school, right, it's a high stakes experience, right? You're reading because you have to take a test. You're reading because you have to do an assignment. And when we give them those reading logs and ask them to read at home, lots of times kids at home have 1,000 things going on in the background, right? There's other kids, there's moms cooking dinner, dad's coming home from work, all of these things, right? So just giving them that space where they can do that, right? But that's about how your space is created, right? So and considering like mindfulness is not about perfection, right? It's more about reflection, right? So if you have a rough day, reflecting on what that looked like, what you could have done differently that would have created a different reaction from your students, right? Because just like we react to things, so do they.
Mhm.
So we can't expect them to not react when we spend so much time reacting. Um, and that's what ultimately makes space for grace and growth, right? Both for you and your community, right? Because you want and I tell kids all the time, like I spend so much time talking to kids in my office about grace because they want their teachers to give them grace, but they don't give their teachers grace. So sometimes I have to stop and tell them like, okay, well, you're telling me Miss such and such said such and such, but did you ever consider that maybe she had a rough morning? That maybe something happened before she came to work that caused her to respond in a certain way that she normally doesn't. And they're like, oh, I say, teachers have feelings too. And sometimes they have to sit with that for a minute and like think about like, okay, you're right, Dr. Morale. Like other people, things could have happened just like some days I come and I'm in a bad mood. because of something that has nothing to do with my teacher or my classmates or anything, or maybe I didn't get enough rest. And I want people to say, you want to be able to come in my office and say, I'm just having a bad day. Your teacher can have that same opportunity if she feels like, she can say, you know what, today I'm having a rough day. I'm having a rough morning. I need a few minutes to reset. And then we'll move on, just like, you do. So I think just keeping that in mind as well, right? Modeling what we want our kids, what we want them to do.
Yeah. And, I think when we picture in our ecosystem the ripples are water on purpose because that reflects what is
Hmm.
there. So, it's so important for us to, and in the ripples, self is in the middle. So everything else stems out from us, and being able to notice what is in that reflection, what is happening in the environment that's being reflected back at me, so that I can also then have that gauge of, okay, maybe I can make a little shift in this moment. And that's the power of presence and embodiment, which is making me think of this next question, because last month's theme was presence and embodiment. And I'm wondering how those two layers are necessary for cultivating culturally affirming and equitable practices. Like, what if these were not embodied skills? What if we were not present? Like, how can we develop this through that aspect of presence and embodiment?
So, well, first, presence allows us to like actually see what's really happening. So I think that's key with anything, right? We have to be able to see what's happening. Um, and with our students, in ourselves, and in the systems around us, right? Because especially in education, there's so many parts of the system that we can control, and there's a lot of parts, way more parts that we can't control, right?
Right.
Um, and just being aware of that. And then embodiment means that we don't just talk about the equity, right? We're actually living it. So we can model that emotional regulation. Um, that's a big one, modeling emotional regulation. So if you need, and I get this a lot, if you need an administrator to come to your classroom because something's going on with the student, how you express that need, right? You can either escalate the situation or you can de-escalate the situation, right? There are times where you will need support, right? But if you're yelling for an administrator, just like the kid yelled that made you call the administrator, there's a little bit of a power struggle now, right? And no one is going to take anything good from that situation, right? So just modeling that emotional regulation is so important. And I know sometimes, just like we're human, right? People get upset, but just keeping that in mind. And then holding space for discomfort, right? There's going to be things that you'll be uncomfortable with in these processes. Just like your students will be, uncomfortable sometimes. And then always show up in ways that align with our values, right? Again, there's so many things in education that we can't control, right? But w- there are so many things that, are a part of your value set that you can use, to support your scholars. Um, and those are things that, you can help to, bring out in them as well. And then without presence, equity becomes performative, right? So making sure you're present in these actions that you're taking and not just doing it because you read a book about it or you listened to this podcast and this learncast and you were like, oh, I'm going to do such and such. What does it look like for you, right? So that's why you have to be present. You have to be a part of it. You can't just, put the posters on the wall of, whatever and then say, oh, this is it, right? You have to use it as part of your instruction. You have to um make connections with the book you read, have those conversations with your kids. So with presence, it becomes a daily relational practice, right? When you're doing it all the time, it becomes part of your environment and part of that space. And those are the things that lead to that psychological safety for your scholars.
And part of who you are. And in the Learncast episode, I was sharing how even moving from modeling to embodiment, where modeling might be, okay, I'm going to intentionally put this poster, but eventually through presence and ongoing practice, then this becomes that way of being and fully embodying it. So you and we, all of us, can start um, really showing up fully as ourselves in our environments with our learners and with our staff and with our families. So I did hear a personal practice around values and connecting to values, and I'm curious to kind of help that embodiment development. Are there any other personal practices that you know of that we can share or that you'd like to share with our listeners and mindful community of just developing personally our cultural competence and just equity in general and how we're approaching all of that?
Yeah, so I think daily self check-ins are important. Considering thinking about who am I centering today? Who am I overlooking, right? Um, that's the first step in making even small ripples, right? Just thinking about, okay, these are the kids, that today I spent a lot of time with kids who, in my position, a lot of time, sometimes I spend a lot of time with kids who have, been removed from their classrooms, right, for different reasons, right? But that leaves a whole different subset of kids that are overlooked, right? Because I've spent this time doing this. So considering that so that you can be intentional about creating those spaces for other kids. Um, and then listening circles, right? So just mindful listening circles where you don't have to sometimes you don't even have to ask a guiding question, right? You just give kids 5 minutes of uninterrupted talk time, and they will tell you everything you need to know, whether you wanted to know or not. But just giving them, sometimes I have kids come in during lunch, and it'll just be, a space like, okay, what's going on? How do you feel? Um, they'll lead with something, and then I'll kind of ask some questions in there to kind of get more information. But just giving them that space to just talk. And honestly, sometimes kids just want to spill it for 5 minutes and then they take a deep breath and they move on. But it will give you some ways that you can some tools that you can use to be proactive in situations, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I think when you consider if you're someone who is a disciplinarian, um, taking a grounding breath before discipline conversations is very important, right? So you can move from reaction to response, right? Because no, you're not going to always believe that little Johnny did A, B, C, D. Sometimes you need to take a moment to reset yourself before you respond to what little Johnny did so that we can actually consider why this might have happened, right? Because sometimes we have to do different discipline things, but ultimately we want to make sure this doesn't happen again. So we can't just react to it. We have to have like an actual response. So giving yourself that space. Um, and then this is something that I started doing recently, journaling about my own school experiences, right? And how they may have shaped different lenses I have on education now. Um, because sometimes you don't consider it. Every once in a while, and pop into your mind and say, huh, I did such and such today in my classroom. But now that I think of it, it's very similar to what a teacher did to me. And I didn't like it very much. So maybe I need to start kind of, so I think kind of journaling those things that happen and you can kind of think about how you can, respond differently next time, right? So that you can continue to grow and give yourself some grace, of course, but continue to grow as well.
Yeah. So, I'm definitely hearing the values, the breath, journaling, the check-in, and even just when we're having those moments to be able to check in, asking ourselves like, okay, what am I feeling? Becoming present, like when this situation happened, what am I feeling inside my body, and how does that guide my next step? And noticing what kinds of environments might have different kinds of reactions within, so that that can help us to continue to develop these practices within ourselves, and then also having the equitable practices for ourselves as well. So what do we need? How can we advocate and share our voice for the different kinds of level of support that maybe we need within and beyond the classroom? These same practices can be also outside. We could be journaling around different activating experiences that maybe we can identify different patterns with that might have had a connection to a lack there or absence of a culturally affirming experience. Maybe we can take those perspectives too. So all of those could be personal practices along the way. And I'm wondering, oh, and what came to mind too for values, Brene Brown has wonderful resources for personal practice and developing and identifying values. So for our listeners, that's also a really wonderful resource. And Elena Aguilar also has some really great resources for values as well. But thinking about resources, I think this is really coming to our last question is, do you have any other resources that you can recommend to help educators and leaders to get started with exploring culturally affirming and equitable practices? What are some of those options that are coming to mind for you?
Yes, absolutely. I think I'm a reader, so that's where I kind of lead from. Um, but I think oh, let me give you the name of the book. And I meant to pull it off the shelf before I we started. Um, okay, Unearthing Joy. Dr. Goldie
Oh,
Muhammad would
yes, Goldie's
be
book. Yes. Oh, that's
yes, yes. And then her other book, Cultivating Genius, right?
Mhm.
Which is more in the literacy, on the literacy side of things. But I was a reading teacher, so that, makes sense for me. But Unearthing Joy, A Guide to Culturally and Historically Responsive Teaching and Learning, I think is a great place to start. Um, if you're a reader, of course. And even if you're not, check it out anyway.
Yes. Or the audiobooks,
Yes,
right?
you can absolutely do the audiobooks. Yes, yes,
Yes.
yes.
Yeah, well, and for our listeners too, we can definitely put the links to the different resources that were shared as well. But any other resources that you wanted to mention before we move into our closing?
I think that's about it. But what I will say about the books, any books, if you are an educator that engages with a lot of professional reading, I always suggest doing it in a group setting if you can. Set up, even if it's a little informal book study, just because I find it so helpful to have conversations around the books as you're reading them. So even if it's just one or two other educators who are also interested, I think that just A, it makes it more fun, and B, it gives you somebody else to like spring ideas off of and really think about how the impact that the what your that learning can make in your classroom. So I think that's just helpful. And why not set up a little, coffee date or, you know, um time to get together with some of your teacher friends, I call my teacher soulmates, and have a little chat about, the book or whatever. So I think that's always a good idea.
Yeah, and that also maybe even as an organization educating mindfully, maybe there's a particular book for our summer book club that we might be able to do. And also that's why we're doing this LearnCast. So for those who are members, please engage in the conversation in our online community and share your resources and ask questions. Um, so that we can continue this learning in a community. And that's the power of community. And the beauty of our organization is it is international. So we get all kinds of different perspectives and have the opportunity for that.
Right.
So really that is our next step for our LearnCast here today, is that our members, we will continue this conversation in that community. And each week this month, we will post a reflection question. And by sharing your own insights and responding to a peers, you can earn professional development hours, the PD hours and CEU hours. So you can learn more about that at educatingmindfully.org/learncast. We'll also release a companion voices blog post and a mindfulness-based learning lesson inspiration to inspire and support you as you integrate the culturally affirming and equitable practices into your teaching and leading for this upcoming month. And then for all of that and this amazing learning where we've been here together, just inviting for a moment to pause and and committing to one action to take, inviting any idea to extend this experience and learning into your life within and beyond the classroom or school, depending on your role. And just take a conscious couple breaths and see what comes to mind. Perhaps writing anything down, And as we close, just so much gratitude for you, Dr. Kristi Morale, for being here. And we're just so grateful for your leadership on our board and the work that you're doing. And anything else you wish to share before we officially close for our time?
I think that's it. Thank you all so much for listening. And I look forward to interacting with you on the member side.
All right. Take care for now, everybody. Thank you for being mindful global citizens.
We hope this episode inspires you to take action as a mindful leader and educator. As we close, we invite you to pause where you are for an invitational breathing practice. Maybe placing one hand at your heart and/or one hand on your stomach. And together, we will take 4 collective breaths, integrating our learning, 1 breath for each ripple within our framework's educational ecosystem. First and foremost, breathing for ourselves. Inhale. Exhale. Next, breathing in for our staff. Inhale. Exhale. Third, breathing in for our students. Inhale. Sipping a little bit more air for our students. Exhale. And finally, breathing in for our worldwide community. Take the biggest inhale yet. Exhale. Consider pausing and committing a collective intention together by saying, we are mindful global citizens. We invite you to continue this conversation with us and our member online community. Learn more about our nonprofit's LearnCast membership and our mindfulness-based learning micro-credential program at www.educatingmindfully.org. My name is Dee DuBose, and on behalf of our leadership team, we thank you for learning with us as we collectively do our parts to make schools and Mother Earth better than we found it. Have a great day on purpose. Peace.